Most people who hear a life sentence handed down go completely still. A tear, maybe a blank stare, a slow nod. But every so often, a defendant shows the whole courtroom exactly who they are the moment those words are spoken. These are 15 of the most jaw-dropping sentencing moments ever caught on camera. 1. Dexter Johnson, a double murder in Houston, Texas in 2006, and a sentencing so chaotic that officers had to call for medical assistance before it was over. In the early hours of June 18, 2006, 18-year-old Dexter Johnson was riding around Harris County with 4 other teenagers, looking for someone to rob. They spotted 23-year-old college student Maria Aparez and her 17-year-old boyfriend Hui Nyo sitting in her blue Toyota Matrix, parked outside No's house. Johnson approached the driver's window with a shotgun, forced the door open, threw both of them into the back seat, and drove off. The group took the couple to a secluded area where Johnson sexually assaulted Aparez, while No was forced to listen. Afterward, both victims were marched into nearby woods, where Johnson and an accomplice shot them both in the head and left them there. Prosecutors would later describe the night as part of a 25-day crime spree, during which Johnson and his associates were also linked to 3 other murders across the area. Investigators connected Johnson to the crime through Aparez's stolen credit card, which had been used at a Walmart in Porter in the hours after she went missing. Surveillance footage from the store, combined with testimony from co-defendants who had taken plea deals, gave police the rest of what they needed. Johnson was arrested, charged with capital murder, and tried as an adult in Harris County. The jury convicted him in 2007 on the strength of both witness testimony and his own recorded admissions to investigators. At sentencing, when the death penalty was formally read out, Johnson threw a chair across the courtroom and had to be tackled by sheriff's deputies. His family erupted in the gallery, and the chaos spilled out into the hallway, getting severe enough that an officer called for medical assistance for distraught family members in the crowd. His execution was later stayed by a federal appellate court over newly raised claims of intellectual disability. Johnson has remained on death row ever since. That reaction turned an entire courthouse upside down, but the next case belongs to a teenager who sat through his own verdict smiling. 2. Michael Swanson, a 17-year-old from Minnesota. 2 women shot dead at 2 separate convenience stores in northern Iowa on the same night, and a defendant who could barely contain his amusement through the whole proceedings. On November 15, 2010, Swanson stole his mother's Jeep Grand Cherokee and drove south from St. Louis Park, Minnesota into Iowa. His first stop was the Crossroads convenience store in Algona, around 9 in the evening, where 47-year-old Vicky Bowman Hall was working. He walked in wearing a ski mask, demanded cash and cigarettes, and shot her in the face even after she complied. He then drove about 30 miles south to Humboldt, where he walked into the Coom and Go and shot 61-year-old Sheila Myers the same way, leaving with $31 and some cigarettes. By that same night, he was arrested at a McDonald's in Webster City. Inside the Jeep, officers found the ski mask, the handgun, and the clothing he had worn during both murders. During questioning, Swanson described the shootings with almost no emotion. He told investigators he felt powerful pulling the trigger and that the whole thing had no effect on him at all. A court-appointed psychiatrist later testified that Swanson said he had been fascinated by death and violence since childhood and had been mentally planning to kill someone since the age of 13. The defense entered an homage insanity plea, pointing to years of untreated mental illness and repeated failed attempts by his family to get him psychiatric help through the system. His mother testified about the years of warning signs, describing a son she could never quite reach no matter how hard she tried. The jury convicted Swanson of first-degree murder for Myers' death after less than an hour of deliberation. He then pleaded guilty to the murder of Bowman Hall. At sentencing in 2011, the judge called him evil and said there was no point in lecturing him. Swanson smirked and laughed through the entire proceeding, showing zero remorse. He received 2 life sentences, running concurrently. Swanson made no effort to pretend otherwise, but the next case is about a teenager who rehearsed his tears ahead of time. 3. Dylan Shoemaker, a 16-year-old babysitter in Springville, New York, a toddler who did not survive the night, and a defendant who bragged about being able to cry on command before he ever walked into court. On March 19, 2013, Shoemaker was watching his 19-year-old girlfriend Ashley Smith's 2 young sons at their shared home in Springville while she worked a restaurant shift. The older boy was 23-month-old Austin Smith, just days away from his second birthday. When Ashley came home, Austin was unresponsive. Shoemaker later testified that he got frustrated when Austin would not stop crying. He slapped the toddler in the face, spanked him, and slammed his head against the floor while changing his diaper. He then placed a pillow over the back of Austin's head and punched down through it several times, saying he was afraid the noise would wake up the infant. The medical examiner determined that the repeated blunt trauma caused a fatal brain bleed. Shoemaker had called 911 before Ashley got home, claiming Austin had just stopped breathing. First responders found bruising across the toddler's face and body, and given the extent of the injuries, it was clear from the start this was not an accident. Shoemaker was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. At trial, he took the stand crying, telling the jury he never wanted to hurt Austin and that he truly loved the child. But the prosecution had a phone recording that said otherwise. While in custody at the Erie County Holding Center, Shoemaker called his mother and told her he was a 16-year-old blonde and that all he had to do was cry in front of the jury and they would feel sorry for him. The judge read that statement aloud at sentencing and called Shoemaker a manipulator and a deceiver, noting he had also sent over 200 texts during the babysitting shift, trying to arrange a hookup and sell drugs to friends. The jury convicted him of second-degree murder. When the maximum sentence of 25 years to life was handed down, Shoemaker sobbed dramatically in the courtroom, right on schedule. Shoemaker planned those tears in advance. But the next case involves a teenager who had investigators completely convinced for nearly a full day before everything came apart. 4. Gregory Ramos, a 15-year-old in DeBerry, Florida, a mother strangled in her own home, and a cover-up that started unraveling within hours. On November 2, 2018, Volusia County deputies responded to a burglary call in DeBerry. 15-year-old Gregory Ramos met them at the door and said he had come home from school to find the house ransacked and his 46-year-old mother, Gail Clevenger, missing. Her van was still in the driveway with the engine running, and Ramos handed officers a detailed list of things the supposed burglars had taken. Convincing enough at first glance, but investigators noticed problems almost immediately. Ramos had fresh scratches on his face, and every time someone asked about them, his explanation shifted. When detectives brought him in for questioning, the story collapsed entirely. He confessed to strangling his mother after an argument over his grades turned physical. He said she struck him first and that things escalated near midnight. Investigators later determined the strangulation itself took close to 30 minutes to complete. Afterward, Ramos loaded her body into a wheelbarrow, transferred it into the family van, and drove to the nearby River City Church, where he buried her beneath a fire pit behind the building. He then called 2 friends over, and the 3 of them staged the inside of the house to look like a robbery before Ramos placed the call to police. Once investigators learned his friends had spoken, Ramos confessed in full. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, abuse of a dead body, and tampering with evidence. At sentencing, the judge allowed his 84-year-old grandmother to approach him one last time before he was taken away. She prayed over him and told him she would always be there for her grandson. Ramos stood with tears in his eyes and addressed the court directly, saying he was there to honor his mother and that because of his actions, he would never truly get to know who she was. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison, with a parole review possible after 25 years. Ramos staged a crime scene to cover his tracks, but coming up next is someone who used their own car as the weapon. 5. McKenzie Shirilla, a Toyota Camry, a brick building in Strongsville, Ohio, and a crash prosecutors argued was anything but an accident. In the early morning hours of July 31st, 2022, surveillance cameras in Strongsville caught a car making what looked like a routine right turn before accelerating to close to 100 miles per hour within seconds. 17-year-old McKenzie Shirilla was behind the wheel. Her 20-year-old boyfriend, Dominic Russo, was in the passenger seat, and 19-year-old Davian Flanagan was in the back. She drove straight into the Plidco building, a large brick structure at the intersection of Progress and Alameda Drives, a route she had no regular reason to use. Russo and Flanagan were both pronounced dead at the scene. Shirilla survived with injuries to her legs. The wreck went undiscovered for about 45 minutes until a passerby found it and called police. What followed was a months-long investigation that moved steadily away from accident. Data from the car's event recorder showed the accelerator was pressed completely to the floor throughout, and that the brake pedal was never applied before impact. The vehicle had no mechanical defects. Investigators also found that Shirilla had driven that same route just days before and chose an hour when almost no one would be nearby. Phone records and witness accounts showed the relationship with Russo had grown increasingly volatile in the weeks before the crash. Prosecutors argued the whole thing was deliberate, with Flanagan simply in the wrong seat at the wrong moment. The defense raised alternative explanations and maintained there was no way to know for certain what happened inside the car. Since it was a bench trial, the verdict rested entirely with the judge, who found Shirilla guilty on all 12 counts. At sentencing, Shirilla sobbed through a prepared statement, telling the court she was deeply sorry and could never have let this happen on purpose. She shook her head visibly throughout the victim impact statements. She was sentenced to 15 years to life, with both murder counts running concurrently. Shirilla cried through her statement, but the next case belongs to a mother whose reaction was louder than anything the defendant said. 6. Kayandria Cook. In March 2017, 17-year-old Kayandria Cook used the Meet Me dating app to lure Perry Nida, a man from Palm Coast, to a meeting in South Daytona. Nida brought along his friend Emmanuel Purcell. When the two men arrived, Cook's then-boyfriend, Kendrick Bass, was waiting. He jumped into the back seat wearing a ski mask and pointed a gun at them. When Purcell pushed back, Bass fired twice, striking Purcell in the stomach. Purcell survived, but the violence was far from over. The following day, Cook and Bass carried out a second carjacking. No one was shot, but both were arrested. Bass was later sentenced to 20 years in prison. Cook entered a no-contest plea to charges of principal, to carjacking with a deadly weapon, attempted carjacking with a deadly weapon, and aggravated battery with a deadly weapon. At her first sentencing in June 2017, Cook clearly expected to walk out of court that day. Her attorney had reportedly told her she would likely receive probation. So when the judge handed down 20 years, her mother erupted in the courtroom, wailing and falling to the floor so loud the judge had to pause and restate the sentence for the court clerk. Cook told the court she was sorry, that she had changed, and that she was on track to be the first in her family to bring home a diploma. That original sentence was eventually thrown out after Cook's attorneys produced a recording of her public defender telling her she would not go to prison. The judge found there had been a miscommunication and allowed her to withdraw the plea. The judge said he believed she had potential but could not overlook that she had repeated essentially the same crime just one day after the shooting. She was sentenced to 11 years in prison with a concurrent 20 years of probation. Cook's mother made sure everyone in that courtroom heard how she felt, but up next is a case where two teenagers decided their teacher had to die over a bad grade. 7. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. Two 16-year-old students in Fairfield, Iowa, a Spanish teacher ambushed on her afternoon walk, and a motive so trivial it was almost impossible to believe. On November 2, 2021, 66-year-old Nahima Graber finished her school day at Fairfield High School and drove to Chautauqua Park, where she took her regular afternoon walk. She never made it home. Miller and Goodale had spent roughly 2 weeks planning the attack. According to court testimony, Miller's motivation was a grade Graber had given him in Spanish class that he believed was threatening his GPA and a planned study abroad program. He recruited Goodale, and the two surveilled the park and mapped out Graber's walking route. When she came through, Miller struck her from behind with a baseball bat. Miller, who said he was there as the lookout, testified that after Miller hit her, he moved Graber off the trail and then struck her himself several times when he realized she was still breathing. Afterward, the two used a wheelbarrow to move her body near the railroad tracks, covered it with a tarp and placed railroad ties over it, then drove her van to a remote road before calling a friend to pick them up. Her body was found the next morning. The case broke when a friend showed police screenshots of Goodale's Snapchat messages in which he had described in detail how the killing was carried out. Both teenagers were arrested within days. At their respective sentencing hearings in 2023, the two took very different approaches. Miller showed little visible emotion and had delayed taking responsibility right up until days before his trial was set to begin, when he finally entered a guilty plea. Goodale, on the other hand, sobbed through his statement, told the Graber family he was truly sorry, and at one point broke down so completely that his nose started to bleed in the middle of the hearing. Miller was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Goodale received life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. That courtroom saw two very different reactions from two co-defendants. But the next case has a defendant who had the whole room talking to God. Number 8. Damon Kemp. A double murder in a Daytona Beach apartment in December 2018, and a first court appearance so unhinged it became its own story. Trey Ingram was a 19-year-old former Bethune-Cookman University student, an amateur boxer who trained at a local gym and was working his way back towards school. He had been letting Damon Kemp, a fellow former student, stay at his apartment rent-free to help him get back on his feet. On the night of December 6, 2018, Kemp shot Ingram 4 times inside apartment 434 at the Jade Park apartment homes on Jimmy Ann Drive. Jordan Payton, also 19, who had come to visit Ingram, was shot 6 times. Their bodies were found near the apartment door, as if both had been trying to get away. Neighbors had heard the gunshots the night before, but no one called police. The following day, officers responding to an unrelated armed burglary at the same complex encountered Kemp in the hallway, acting erratically. He ran up to an officer and told him directly that he had killed his friend. Police traced his address back to Ingram's apartment, where they found the bodies, shell casings, and blood-covered walls. A .40 caliber Glock, later identified as the murder weapon, was recovered nearby. Kemp was arrested and charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. At his first appearance, hearing the following morning, Kemp was wheeled into court, strapped to a chair. What followed was hard to watch. He screamed out the word "God" repeatedly, his face cycling through wild expressions that alarmed everyone in the room, including the judge and the victims' families in the gallery. He was convicted in May 2023, 5 years after the murders, and sentenced that August. At sentencing, Kemp still would not directly admit or deny the killings. He told the judge he hoped she would see him as a fair and civilized person and give him another chance at life. Judge Leah Case sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms. Kemp's first court appearance is something people still talk about, but wait until you see what happened when the next defendant heard his sentence. 9. Brandon Spencer. A shooting outside a Halloween party near the USC campus in Los Angeles in October 2012, and a sentencing moment involving a forehead and a table that no one in the room forgot. On the night of October 31st, 2012, a party hosted by the Black Student Assembly near the University of Southern California campus drew a crowd of around 400 people. Neither Spencer nor any of the 4 shooting victims were USC students. Prosecutors argued that 18-year-old Brandon Spencer, whom they identified as a documented gang member, had a long-standing feud with reputed Crips member Gino Hall, going back to a 2011 incident where Spencer had been shot in the stomach. According to the prosecution, Spencer fired into the crowd outside the party seeking revenge, injuring Hall and 3 other bystanders, Misson Downs, Thomas Ritchie, and Devontae Smith. The defense maintained Spencer was not the shooter and pointed to significant inconsistencies across the eyewitness accounts. Spencer maintained his innocence throughout the trial and insisted he had simply run from the sound of gunshots. The case relied heavily on witness testimony and DNA evidence that defense attorneys argued was inconclusive. The jury convicted him of 4 counts of attempted first-degree murder in February 2014. When the verdict was read, Spencer flipped a chair in the courtroom and had to be physically restrained by deputies, who pinned him to the ground and handcuffed him. At his sentencing, 2 months later, in April 2014, he addressed the judge before the sentence was read, pleading for a second chance and saying he was sorry for what had happened, but that he could not spend the rest of his life in prison for something he did not do. When the 40 years to life sentence was handed down, Spencer broke down, sobbing, and slammed his forehead into the desk in front of him twice, hard enough that deputies moved in immediately to hold him back. He was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. 10. Sandel Jackson. Up next, we have a robbery that ended in a killing on the streets of Milwaukee in July 2009, and a sentencing that required pepper spray before it was over. Nathan Potter was 21 years old, a film student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and by all accounts someone who kept to himself and caused no trouble. On the night of July 6, 2009, he was walking home to his River West apartment after a night out when 18-year-old Sandel Jackson and a companion spotted him and decided to rob him. Potter had no money on him. Jackson shot and killed him anyway. Jackson fled to Mississippi the following day and was tracked down and arrested there in September by the U.S. Marshals Gulf Coast Regional Fugitive Task Force. He was brought back to Milwaukee and charged with first-degree intentional homicide and attempted robbery. His co-defendant, Derek Thomas, pleaded guilty to acting as the lookout, and received 12 years in prison. Throughout the trial, Jackson made it clear he had no regard for the Potter family sitting across the courtroom. He smirked at them, cursed at them, and gestured at them more than once, drawing repeated intervention from court staff. He was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide in February 2010. Deputies were already on edge by the time sentencing arrived in April, and for good reason. When Judge Rebecca Dallet handed down life in prison without the possibility of parole, Jackson glared at the Potter family, then screamed obscenities at the judge as 3 deputies tackled him to the floor. It took pepper spray to bring him under control. While Jackson was being subdued, members of his family turned to the Potters and screamed that they hated them and that God was the judge. Nathan Potter's father, speaking to the judge before the sentence was read, asked whether there was such a thing as pure evil. Given what followed, it was hard to argue there wasn't. Jackson was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. 11. Isabella Guzman. The relationship between Isabella Guzman and her mother, Yun Mi Hoi, had been deteriorating badly through the summer of 2013. Things reached a breaking point in late August, when Guzman spat in her mother's face during an argument. The next morning, she sent Hoi an email that read, "You will pay." Terrified, Hoi called the police, who came to the house that afternoon. Isabella's biological father, Robert, also came by to talk to her. Neither helped. That evening, Hoi came home from work and went upstairs to shower. Ryan heard a thumping sound and then his wife calling his name. He rushed up and found Guzman pushing against the bathroom door from inside to keep him out. When blood appeared under the door, he ran downstairs to call 911. By the time he got back up, Guzman was walking out holding a bloody knife. She moved past him without a word. Inside, Ryan found Yun Mi Hoi on the floor, stabbed 79 times in the face, neck, and torso. Guzman fled the scene. She was found in a nearby parking garage the following afternoon, still wearing the same blood-covered clothing she had on during the attack. During interrogation, Guzman denied being herself entirely. She told detectives her name was Samantha Gonzalez, said she had no idea who Isabella Guzman was, and refused to recognize her own father when he was brought in. At her arraignment on September 5, 2013, she had to be dragged from her cell. Once in the courtroom, she smirked and made faces directly at the cameras, seemingly indifferent to everything happening around her. Doctors who evaluated her diagnosed her with paranoid schizophrenia. She told investigators she had not believed the woman she killed was her mother, but a woman named Cecilia, and that killing her was the only way to save the world. The district attorney concluded Guzman genuinely did not know right from wrong at the time of the crime. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed indefinitely to the Colorado Mental Health Institute. 12. Nicholas Lindsey. On the night of February 21, 2011, Officer David Crawford, a 25-year veteran of the St. Petersburg Police Department, spotted 16-year-old Nicholas Lindsey and stopped his patrol car to confront him about car break-ins in the area. Lindsey had been using a screwdriver to try to start a stolen car. Crawford got out of his cruiser, pulled out his notepad, and waved Lindsey over. He had no weapon in his hand. Lindsey pulled out a .380 caliber handgun he had bought for $140 and shot Crawford 5 times. Crawford collapsed and later died. He was 46 years old. After shooting Crawford, Lindsey fled the scene and threw the gun into a nearby creek. The manhunt lasted more than 24 hours. Tips from the community, including from Lindsey's own mother, who suspected her son after hearing the description of the suspect, led police to him. He was arrested the following night. With his parents present during questioning, he broke down and confessed. At trial, the defense conceded Lindsey had pulled the trigger but argued the shooting was impulsive, pushing for a manslaughter conviction. The prosecution countered that he had fired until his gun was empty, hitting Crawford with every single shot. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours and convicted him of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case went through a resentencing process after a Supreme Court ruling on juvenile life sentences, but the judge reviewed all the factors and upheld the sentence. At the final resentencing hearing in October 2013, Lindsey sat there with a visible grin as the judge read his decision aloud. Crawford's daughter Amanda was in court, as she had been for every proceeding. She told reporters afterward that his smiling proved exactly what she already believed him to be. He remains in prison, serving life without the possibility of parole. Lindsey smiled through his sentencing, But up next is a defendant whose behavior in court was so disrespectful, the judge nearly threw the plea deal out entirely. 13. Dantrell Wright, a 17-year-old in Ann Arbor, Michigan, an 18-year-old shot dead during a robbery, and a sentencing hearing where the judge came closer than most to tearing up a plea agreement on the spot. In October 2016, Jordan Klee was 18 years old and a senior at Pioneer High School in Ann Arbor. He was a football player, a strong student who had won academic awards. His body was found by a maintenance worker on a path near the Pine Lake Village Cooperative on October 4th. He had been shot once in the head. Dantrell Wright, then 17, along with Jamarius Ellison and Delrano Gracie, had tried to rob Klee at gunpoint. Klee told them he had no money on him. Wright shot him anyway and left. Wright pleaded guilty to armed robbery, felony firearm, and second-degree murder ahead of trial. At sentencing in July 2017, Klee's family delivered victim impact statements in court. As Jordan's cousin read a statement on behalf of his grieving mother describing the loss of her only child, Wright sat there smiling, shaking his head, and at moments nearly laughing. When Wright was given the chance to address the court, he told the room he would be home soon and that he loved his family. Washtenaw County Judge David Swartz was not having it. He told Wright he had never in 23 years on the bench rejected a plea agreement. But watching him sit there smiling and shaking his head like none of this mattered, he was very tempted to do exactly that. He warned Wright that if he went to trial on felony murder instead, he would die in prison. Klee's family decided they could not put themselves through a trial. So despite everything, the plea deal held. Wright was sentenced to 23 to 50 years for second-degree murder and armed robbery, plus a consecutive 2 years for the felony firearm charge, bringing his total minimum to 25 years behind bars. Wright's attitude made the judge question everything, but what comes next is a defendant who left the courtroom screaming at the jury. 14. Caius Veovvis. The whole thing started with a witness. David Glasser, 44, had been beaten by Adam Lee Hall in 2009 after Hall accused him of stealing a car part. Glasser went to police, and Hall, a sergeant-at-arms for the local Hells Angels chapter, was charged with assault. Glasser was scheduled to testify against him in September of 2011. He never made it to court. Glasser and 2 others, 58-year-old Edward Frampton and 47-year-old Robert Chadwell, disappeared from Glasser's Pittsfield apartment on August 27th and 28th, 2011, right as Tropical Storm Irene swept through the region. Their dismembered bodies were found buried in a trench on private property in Beckett, Massachusetts, 10 days later. Hall orchestrated the killings with 2 accomplices. One of them was Caius Veovvis. Born Roy Gutfinski Jr., he had legally changed his name in 2008, while serving time in a Maine prison for a bloodletting assault. He had horn-like subdermal implants in his forehead, a 666 tattoo, additional facial and neck tattoos, and a sharpened tongue. Prosecutors argued he aspired to become a Hells Angels member and participated in the murders for that purpose. All 3 men were tried separately. Hall and co-defendant David Shirilla were convicted first and given life sentences. Veovvis stood trial last. In September 2014, the case drew attention both because of his appearance and because there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime at all. No DNA, no murder weapon, just witness testimony. The jury deliberated for 6 days before convicting him. When the verdict was read, Veovvis turned to the jury and screamed that he would see them all in hell, every one of them. At his sentencing the following Monday, he maintained his innocence in a written statement, insisting his hand was not in any of it. The judge gave him 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Veovvis made sure no one in that courtroom ever forgot that moment, and that brings us to the final case on this list. 15. Adam Lee Hall. The man who set all of that in motion, a Hells Angels sergeant-at-arms from Berkshire County, and a sentencing that brought one of the most disturbing witness elimination cases in Massachusetts history to a close. Hall had been the one with a reason to want David Glasser dead. In 2009, Hall beat Glasser with a baseball bat, accusing him of stealing a car part. Glasser went to police. Hall was charged with assault and related offenses, and Glasser was the key witness set to testify against him in court, so Hall arranged to have the problem removed. Working with David Shirilla and Caius Veovvis, he had all 3 men killed inside Glasser's apartment on the night they disappeared. Frampton and Chadwell were murdered simply for being there. A 4th man, David Casey, a backhoe operator, helped bury the bodies on private property in Beckett and later cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a greatly reduced charge. Hall was tried first. In January 2014, with the proceedings moved from Berkshire County to Springfield because of intense pretrial publicity, the case rested almost entirely on witness testimony. No DNA evidence was ever recovered, and no murder weapon was found. Cooperating witness Casey testified in detail about how Hall described the killings, including that Glasser had begged for his life. As Hall told him, this was exactly what happened to people who testified against him. After 16 hours of deliberation across 4 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with kidnapping and witness intimidation. When the verdict was read, Hall hung his head. At sentencing 4 days later, the judge called Hall's crimes filled with depravity and a complete disregard for human dignity. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, later reduced from 5 to 4 consecutive life terms following appellate review. And that wraps up 15 of the most jaw-dropping sentencing reactions ever caught on camera. If you made it to the end of this one, drop a comment below. Tell us which reaction shocked you the most, because honestly, this list was hard to rank. And if you think we missed someone who deserved a spot, let us know that too. We'll see you in the next one.